And good morning, everyone. My name is Chandra Walker. I am the co-project director for the IMLS-funded BCLA Breaking Barriers project. We will get started in just. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chandra Walker. I am the co-project director for the IMLS-funded. Sorry about that. I'm Chandra Walker. I'm the co-project director for this exciting IMLS project, Breaking Barriers National Forum. We'll get started in just a second. We're just excited to have Dr. Jarvis Givens with us today to talk about his book, Fugitive Pedagogy. We think it's a nice fit for this project. So again, if you haven't done so already, please feel free to drop into the Zoom chat where you're joining us from, and we'll get started momentarily. We'll give about 2 minutes. We have a couple of people who had some technical difficulties, but we'll give them just a few minutes, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our introductions and segue into Dr. Givens' talk. Thank you. Okay, so without further ado, again, my name is Chandra Walker. I am delighted to welcome you to the Breaking Barriers National Forum Symposium Keynote featuring Dr. Jarvis Givens. My dear friend and colleague, Ms. Jenna Duvernay, will be serving as our moderator for today's program. Ms. Duvernay is a librarian and archivist who actively contributes to a number of committees and initiatives that help to advance librarianship and archival work related to African American history and culture. She serves as counselor at large for the American Library Association and has served as an executive board member for the Black Caucus of ALA. Duvernay holds an MLA from Auburn University at Montgomery and an MLIS from the University of Alabama. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you today. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Chandra. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Gina Duvernay. So thrilled to have Dr. Givens join us today and have the opportunity to introduce him to you all. Jarvis R. Givens is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He specializes in the history of education, African American history, and theories of race and power in education. His first book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, which won the 2022 Asala Book Prize, was published in 2021 by Harvard University Press. Professor Givens is currently building the Black Teacher Archive, an online portal which will house digitized materials documenting the more than 100 history of colored teacher associations. His research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, as well as the William F. Milton Fund. Professor Givens earned his PhD in African American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. He is a native of Compton, California, and currently resides in Roxbury, Massachusetts. So with that, I'd love to welcome you again, Dr. Givens, and I'll turn the platform over to you.
All right. Thank you for that. I appreciate that introduction, Gina, and I appreciate everyone who had a hand in organizing the conference for today and thinking enough for my work to invite me to be a part of this particular session. I'm excited to be in the kind of room with librarians and archivists because they're some of my favorite people, a group of scholars that I grew to have a very, very deep appreciation for when I was in the process of both, well, first writing my dissertation, but then also completing my first book. I think a lot of the materials and information that I was able to locate and identify was only because of conversations that I had with librarians and archivists who helped point me in the direction of in terms of where I needed to go. But there was also a number of narratives and stories about librarians that I encountered, some of which I was able to kind of squeeze in and include in the book. I think about one particular librarian in Cleveland, Ohio in 1946, whose narrative I came across in the oral history, where she talked about working for the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, but also how she would secretly throw away some of the racist books that she came across in the libraries when she was moving as a substitute librarian from one branch to another in Cleveland, Ohio. So I think this educational tradition that I'll be talking about, while I'm focusing specifically on teachers and students in the classrooms, it's a part of a much larger tradition that also includes archivists and librarians as well. Vivian Harsh, right? Of course, Arturo Schomburg and the like. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get to my actual remarks for today. I'm going to share my screen. And the talk that I'm going to be sharing is based on the book that was just introduced. The title of this talk is The Fugitive Life of Black Teaching, A History of Pedagogy and Power. So I encountered a problem when I was a UC Berkeley doctoral student, and it will forever alter the trajectory of my research on education, power, and Black life. A footnote about Carter G. Woodson's textbooks published between 1922 and 1950 and their wide circulation among Black teachers posed a narrative problem. It challenged the impoverished framing of a history told and retold about African-American schooling before Brown versus the Board of Education and the rolling out of desegregation. The idea of African-American school teachers writing textbooks about Black life and culture went against the grain of dominant narratives in public memory, and to be honest, much academic scholarship on the subject as well, where we see iconic stories of separate and unequal, images of dilapidated Negro school buildings, and thorough documentation of white educational authorities' aggressive neglect of Black teachers and students. The history of violent educational inequity is an immutable fact. However, such institutional and ideological histories reveal only part of the story. They do much to document anti-Black persecution in American schooling, but very little to remember the role education played in Black spiritual strivings over the course of generations. They fail to remember the art of Black teaching, a legacy represented by those very textbooks published by Carter G. Woodson and then subversively taken up and put into practice by educators. And what's more, over the course of the 10 years that I spent researching this particular topic and writing this book, I came to learn that those counter narratives found in textbooks written by Black school teachers were only one piece of a more expansive plot against anti-Black protocols in American schools. So now that I've given you a little bit of this background context, I want to now move to the opening scenario of my book and proceed to the remaining comments that I have for today. Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and she taught history in 1933 at the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The all-white Department of Education gave clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to acquaint their students with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum. And yet on many occasions, Ms. McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's book on the Negro, which rested comfortably in her lap. She kept the textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary practices of Jim Crow authorities. But she was undeterred. And one of McGee's students from that year recounted, quote, "She read to us from that book. When the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk, and she began teaching us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of what I am calling fugitive pedagogy. Fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Black protocols of educational domination. And these were actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. And my use of this term fugitive draws inspiration from the literary scholars Stephen Best and Saidiya Hartman in their discussion of what they call fugitive justice, where they introduced the idea of two competing narratives of the fugitive's identity. Fugitive connotes the dual image of one who escapes enslavement or jailed confinement, which justifies his capture, even death, at the hands of law enforcement. And yet, as Best and Hartman explain, the violence of enslavement and legal capture engenders as well the countervailing narrative of and by the fugitive as a victim of anti-Black domination. And we find parallel, equally competing historical images when adapting this concept to American education. The dominant story of the nation's past had long vilified, devalued, and disrespected Black people, thereby justifying their persecution in various forms, including enslavement, disenfranchisement, and imprisonment. This violent reality and the hypocrisy it exposed about the nation prompted a counter-historical narrative and way of knowing. Indeed, one represented in the extensive factual evidence contained in those textbooks by Carter G. Woodson. Wearing the mask, as the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar called it, had long been part and parcel of Black teachers' professional disposition. Tessie McGee's concealed lesson rejected the degrading representations of Black life in official school curricula, and such refusal manifested in physical form. McGee's public display of the official outline was in fact a masked performance of complicity, an embodied text that accompanied the subversive and spoken content of her lesson. McGee's physical act of switching texts also communicated important messages to her students, demonstrating how defiance could at times be disguised by public performances of deference to the coercive regime of school authorities. And so now for the remainder of my time, I want to discuss three aspects of this particular scenario in depth. I want to look closer at the teachers, the textbooks, and the students. I'll offer a closer reading of Tessie McGee's and other educators like her, their efforts to disrupt anti-Black protocols in education. But then I'll take a time to look at Carter G. Woodson's textbooks and how they built on an expansive tradition, an expansive intellectual tradition in the heritage of Black education. And then finally, I'll turn to the students who bore witness to their teachers' fugitive pedagogy, leaving some record of it to be studied in the future. So now the teachers. Teachers like Ms. McGee gained access to alternative scripts of knowledge through what the sociologist Alden Morris has called insurgent intellectual networks. And these were institutions like Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which he founded in 1915 while working as a school teacher, but also colored teacher associations. Such organizations comprised a veiled yet networked Black educational world, one where African Americans often said one thing, but then did another. Because given rampant anti-Black violence, the true political intentions undergirding Black teaching were rarely on full display. African Americans responded, often in quiet calculated acts of resistance against oppressive school settings that reflected a world order built on Black subjection. And fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when manifesting as these individual acts of practice. For example, the principal entering Miss McGee's classroom was a Black man named J.L. Jones. Records suggest that he supported the inclusion of Black history and culture at Webster Parish. We know that he was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which had explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work by the 1930s. And we know that Woodson regularly appeared on the annual programs of Black teacher associations at both the state and national level. And the documents that you see on the screen, one to the left is just of Carter G. Woodson's life membership card in the National Black Teacher Organization. But then also to the right is one of many newspaper clippings where we see Carter G. Woodson appearing at these state and national Black teacher meetings. This is an example from Tennessee, but we also have cases where Woodson was traveling and met with teachers in Louisiana as well. And what we know from the records that we're able to recover is that this principal at Webster Parish Training School was on the executive board of the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which had explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work, right? So this is that connection that's important to think about when reading this scenario from Miss McGee's classroom. So given this context, it is not implausible to consider that Principal Jones and Miss McGee may have very likely conspired together. The principal testing the teacher to ensure she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the classroom. The intrusion of white surveillance had a hand in shaping school ecology. It was not atypical for white people to drop by unannounced during the school day, either to show off their Negro school, as they often put it, or for some routine inspection. Such visits were primarily meant to demonstrate power, which was essential to reproducing domination. So this is all to say, the person entering Miss McGee's classroom could just as easily have been a white school official. Black educators walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive schooling contexts, because if they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. In fact, just a few years prior, the white school board in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, learned of Carter G. Woodson's textbooks being used in the local Black high school. The books were confiscated, teachers were reprimanded, and the principal was threatened with his life and forced to resign. And then after reading the textbook, the school board, quote, expressed horror and surprise that such a work should have crept into our Negro schools, they wrote. Then they went on to assure their white constituents that they would be more vigilant moving forward, stating, quote, we must not take in teachers who will create discord by teaching isms of any sort, end quote. And examples of this kind of violent oversight are plentiful, and they move forward and backwards in time as far as Black teachers are concerned. Black educators were routinely targeted and fired for challenging white authority. Some notable examples being Ida B. Wells, who was fired as a teacher in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1890s, John W. Davison, who was fired from the school that he founded in the early 20th century, and not for teaching African-American history, but for teaching Latin. And similarly, Anna Julia Cooper, around the turn early 20th century, was demoted from her position as principal of the M Street School in Washington, D.C., and of course, the iconic narrative of Septima Clark, who was fired in South Carolina. And yet there were some teachers who lost more than their jobs. Harry and Harriet Moore were fired in 1946 and later killed when their home was bombed in Mims, Florida. Black teachers' awareness of such stories prompted them at times to conceal their pedagogical objectives in the presence of intrusive white power. Subjection to surveillance and violence, motivated by no causal logic whatsoever, was a fact of Blackness. African-American educators developed strategies to contest this reality, which ranged from things that they did from building institutions down to their things that they did at the interpersonal and psychic levels in their classrooms. So fugitivity, in its historical reference, holds in place the realities of constraint and African-Americans' constant straining against said confinement. The language is careful not to overstate one or the other. And as the poet Fred Moten aptly notes, escape is an activity, not an achievement. The possible threat of recapture always lingered. Escape was unresolved and uncertain, and Black teachers carried intimate knowledge of such precarity. So now the textbooks. As I previously mentioned, my concern with the historical framings of Black education actually began with the textbook. I came across a passing reference to Carter G. Woodson's textbook, one of which you see pictured on the screen being read by a group of junior high students in the 1930s in New Orleans. I was aware that Woodson played a central role in African-American studies as the second Black person to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1912, but also as the founder of Negro History Week in 1926, which of course we celebrate today as Black History Month. But even with this prior knowledge, I was shocked to learn about the size of Woodson's impact on educational practice during Jim Crow in the private spaces of Black teachers' classrooms. While most accounts emphasize Woodson's role as a historian, and I'm sure many of you have heard him referred to as the father of Black history, much less have been written about Woodson's near 30-year career as a public school teacher. And what intrigued me most about Woodson's textbooks, as well as those written by Black school teachers before him, was their extensive commemoration of fugitive slaves and Black fugitive life. As early as 1890, Black educators wrote textbooks filled with heroic narratives about enslaved Blacks who absconded from plantations, those who led slave revolts, stories of Black marooned communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, Suriname, Brazil, and Jamaica. But that's not all. The fugitive slave emerged as a folk hero, a cultural symbol in the curriculum developed by these educators. The fugitive slave also appeared in school naming practices and within commemorative ceremonies and school activities. And it was these observations that initially prompted my reliance on the fugitive slave archetype and on fugitive pedagogy as a theory and practice of Black educational life in the United States. So this is all to say that the term is much, much more than just some elaborate metaphor. It names a phenomenon that surfaced within the archival record at multiple levels. And what's more, the concept draws a narrative line from enslaved people's defiance of anti-literacy laws that criminalize Black education, right? So the language of fugitive pedagogy is drawing a narrative line from Black people stealing away at night to learn to read and write, and all of those subversive practices during the period of enslavement, to the actions of educators like Tessie McGee in the post-emancipation period, who continued to engage in subversive practices in education because Black education continued to be met by violent white resistance. And more than this, it was clarifying to learn that the very first Black authored textbooks were actually written by fugitive slaves. James W.C. Pennington, an escaped slave from Maryland, inaugurated this tradition in 1841. A textbook on the origins and history of the colored people represents the beginning of a formalized practice of Black people striving to rewrite the system of knowledge. And the fugitive slave William Wells Brown also wrote a textbook in 1863. So as the 19th century witnessed the proliferation of Black newspapers, journals, and various other forms of Black print culture, textbooks became tools, not only of the masters, but also of the fugitive slave. And such counter readings of the world carried over to Carter G. Woodson's theorizing about Black education. In his iconic book, The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson wrote, quote, "Starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided to work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind inasmuch as the freedom of body had to be conceded," end quote. Here we see Woodson suggesting that the political conflicts at the core of Black education were fundamentally linked to the legacies and social technologies of enslavement. And in his first textbook, The Negro in Our History, Woodson offered the following, quote, "How some of these slaves learned in spite of opposition makes for a beautiful story. Knowing the value of learning as a means of escape and having longing for it too because it was forbidden, many slaves continued their education under adverse circumstances," end quote. So here Woodson named the entanglement of violent white opposition and the enslaved people's steady practice of learning as a means of escape as a generative lesson for students and educators during Jim Crow. Indeed, this was the origin story that framed what was politically at stake in their teaching and learning. At its highest calling, Black education continued to be a stealing away from and refusal of the American school's official protocols and curricula. And so now I want us to consider, just very briefly, the required curriculum that Tessie McGee was supposed to be teaching from. And we're able to recover this information by going to the public school records for the state of Louisiana and identifying what the textbooks were that were adopted in the state by the 1930s, and then going and locating the textbooks and then looking at the content, right? And I'm not gonna go super in depth on these textbooks and spend a lot of time on it, but suffice it to say that they both of the two high school textbooks that were adopted by this time rendered distorted images of Black life and culture. But I want to just give one example from the 10th grade textbook, which was entitled Modern Times and the Living Past by Henry Elson. In the first chapter, Elson wrote, quote, "Not only are almost all the civilized nations of today of the white race, but throughout all the historic ages, this race has taken the lead and has been foremost in the world's progress," end quote. Elson then goes on to explain that, quote, "Almost the entire book will be devoted to the doings of the Caucasian race, or more specifically, at least 9/10 of the book must be given to an account of the Indo-European branch of the race, as the Indo-Europeans have dominated the world for the past 2,500 years," end quote. So based on Louisiana's adopted curriculum, Tessie McGee and her students were narratively condemned, to borrow from the Black Studies scholar Sylvia Winter. It deemed them to be of no human concern. So while we are unaware of the exact passage Ms. McGee may have been reading from Carter G. Woodson's textbook, we at least know what she was negating. And Woodson worked fervently from his office at 1538 9th Street Northwest in the historic Shaw District of Washington, D.C. Woodson lived, worked, and died in this building. And it's from this post that Woodson responded personally to letters written by individual teachers, some writing him with historical questions, others inquiring in hushed tones about how they might strategically work to challenge curriculum standards on a local level. Woodson and his very small staff mailed textbooks to individual teachers in schools across the country. They packaged Negro history kits by hand, and they shipped off decorative materials for teachers to use in refashioning their classrooms. And interestingly enough, Woodson's educational program expanded most dramatically during the Depression years. After developing an unfavorable reputation among white philanthropists by 1930, Woodson came to rely on the Black masses to support his Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And it's important to emphasize that Black teachers were at the forefront of this cause. Woodson charged that the reconstitution of knowledge was a critical step in challenging the violent assaults against Black humanity. He professed, quote, "There would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom," end quote. Woodson often named this schoolroom lynching duality because it highlighted what was fundamentally at stake. Education was not just about vocational trades, developing more African-American professionals, or bourgeois performances of citizenship. It was about insisting on Black social and political life as opposed to death. It meant making legible the social disfiguring of Black humanity that whiteness demands for its propping up, then refusing it through counter readings of both the word and world. Pending radical reformation of the American school, Woodson urged educators to perform bold acts of defiance. So now the students. Black students were always watching. To elevate the significance of Tessie McGee's fugitive pedagogy, I want to invert the scenario and draw your attention to the student as witness. The 16-year-old Jerry Moore, who took note of Miss McGee as she removed her mask of compliance, documenting how, quote, "her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. In recounting this one gesture by his teacher, Jerry Moore revealed how what was seen, heard, and felt in Black classrooms all affected what students learned. Education extended far beyond what was uttered or written. They learned from the value systems that shaped school routines and the actions of their teachers. All the while, students were watching them, witnessing. We find Black students insisting that they have always been more than mere objects of history, but instead its subjects. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944. The scholar and activist recalled that, quote, "Woodson's Negro History Week was the highlight of our year," end quote. During these commemorative weeks, teachers instructed students to, quote, "slam shut and cast aside those books that did their best to persuade us that our ancestors were much better off during slavery than they would have been had they remained in Africa," end quote. And Davis and her schoolmates were then allowed to, quote, "rely on our own ability to produce knowledge about the conditions surrounding our lives," end quote. Students engaged in a shared critique of the normative white curriculum and their casting it aside. More than a captive audience, Black students were active participants, dissident learners participating in a tradition of fugitive pedagogy. And Davis recalled encountering a photo of Harriet Tubman. She states nostalgically, quote, "I remember, I always visualized Harriet Tubman as my grandmother. I thought my grandmother bore this striking resemblance to her, and that still remains with me to this day," end quote. Tubman's picture inspired Davis not only because it shared some likeness with her grandmother, or because of the implications it had for her own raced and gendered body, but also because of the scripts accompanying the image of this fugitive slave. According to Davis, her teachers always emphasized that, quote, "Harriet Tubman helped more slaves to gain their freedom than any of those other conductors on the Underground Railroad," end quote. And when writing about her student experiences in Birmingham, Davis also bore witness to the vulnerability of Black teachers. She described belittling actions of white visitors and school authorities, writing, quote, "When these white assaults were staged, I tried to decipher the look and the emotions on the teacher's face. Acquiescence, obsequiousness, defiance, or was it the pain of realizing that if she did fight back, she would surely lose her job, end quote. Undergirding these experiences was a shared vulnerability between teachers and students. And Davis gives language to this when recalling the racialized violence in Birmingham during her childhood. She recalled the sounds of bombs exploding across the street from her home, as well as her mother having been one of the teachers to one of the young girls killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. Such events reflected the perpetual threat that teachers, students, and communities had to reckon with, both in and outside of the classroom. The shared vulnerability of Black teachers and students prompted shared action. Jerry Moore recognized this in Miss McGee's classroom as her lesson plan switched with the turning of a doorknob. Angela Davis recounted the intellectual partnership between students and teachers as they engaged in a shared critique of the American curriculum. Such moments hinged on a fugitive reading practice of the known world. Congressman John Lewis offered a similar narrative when recalling, quote, the unbelievable teachers in Troy, Alabama, end quote. Lewis explained, quote, when I was a little child growing up in rural Alabama, a short walk to the cotton fields, my teachers would tell us to cut out photographs and pictures of great African Americans for Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week, end quote. Lewis would emphasize that it was these same teachers who discreetly informed him and his classmates about the civil rights protests and boycotts taking place in cities like Montgomery, just miles away. And this transcript of students bearing witness to fugitive pedagogy goes far and wide. In 1929, a student at the National Training School for Women and Girls explained the following in her yearbook. She writes, quote, this school teaches history and Negro history, and the students are tremendously inspired by learning the truth about their own race. Dr. Carter G. Woodson's books are used as the text here, and we have a room, a real library, if you please, set apart for the study of Negro life and history. And then a few pages later, the training school students celebrated one of their peers, Catherine Allen, for being outspoken against matters of racial injustice. Having been inspired by their lessons in Negro history, Allen became a race agitator, as her classmates called her. In fact, quote, many race agitators have been discovered, and Miss Allen, who is a senior, is sure to become another Sojourner Truth, end quote. So these students celebrated the young activist in the making, and the fugitive slave again reappears as a folk hero, Sojourner Truth having been featured as her own superlative category. For students like Angela Davis, John Lewis, and the training school girls, their teachers' fugitive pedagogy allowed them to situate themselves in a continuum of consciousness. They were taught to aspire to be part of a tradition of Black people who disrupted an anti-Black social order. These scenarios, scattered across time and place, were not sporadic, unplanned events or mere infrapolitics. They reflect coordinated efforts on the part of African-American educators. And fugitive pedagogy in the classroom was a dress rehearsal. Students' participation in the subversive politics of Black education anticipated and prefigured their active involvement in the civil rights and Black power movements on the horizon, not to mention their demands for Black studies in colleges and universities in the late 1960s. Resistance was omnipresent in many segregated Black classrooms. Contrary to popular assumptions, Black teachers promoted that resistance in the minds of their students, and it built up over time and culminated in the modern freedom struggle. Their pedagogy was like a river, and it moved through the lives of their students. It ebbed and flowed, took unexpected turns, but always continued in the direction of a new world. The educators called upon in my book are portals into a heritage of fugitive pedagogy. They represent a tradition that has been plundered from today's educators who are today's Black educators who are its rightful inheritors. And yet, all who are committed to critical pedagogy or anti-racist teaching, as the term has recently become popularized, might draw inspiration from their legacy. I see the cast of characters in my book as standard bearers, and their heritage is one worthy of both praise and deep study. So I'm going to end my comments there, and I want to welcome and invite Ms. Gina Duvernay back to the Zoom stage to join me in conversation now to talk about anything that I might have covered quickly that it might be an opportunity to unpack, but any questions that you all have as well that you're able to share in the Q&A feature of the Zoom session. But I'm looking forward to any questions and comments that you all might have. I'm now going to turn it over now to my conversation partner.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was amazing. Very enlightening. So we appreciate you. There are several questions, so we'll go ahead and get to that. I do want to just congratulate you again on the Asala Book Prize. This is an amazing text and well-deserved. So we'll jump right in while we have a few minutes to get into these questions. There's a question from M. Claire. It's a lengthy, but we'll get there, okay? She says, I've been watching the confirmation hearing of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and am struck by how she has been peppered with questions, forcing her to both prove her worth and disprove radicalization. Of course, Ted Cruz interrogated her on critical race theory. We know full well that there's a troublesome and misguided campaign against critical race theory in public spaces, such as courts, libraries, and so on. In thinking about your talk and Judge Brown Jackson's very celebrated educational journey, how are you interpreting the frenzy against critical race theory?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, one of the ways that I'm interpreting it is I'm seeing the kind of current moment with all of the kind of legislative campaigns that publicly are kind of termed as kind of, anti-CRT, but in many ways has to do with restricting how we teach about race and whether or not we can kind of engage in deep study and thinking about the history of racial inequality. So I understand that to be pretty consistent with the much longer time map of the policing of education and what constitutes legitimate knowledge in the context of the United States and even beyond the United States, to be quite honest. And so for me, this moment that we see with this kind of, this kind of fiery and really in many ways kind of violent backlash to Black critical thought or, the Black intellectual tradition in many ways is, while it might seem like a departure from the kind of recent decades where we had lots of DEI initiatives and equity and inclusion and diversity and belonging initiatives and all that kind of stuff that some folks might have became accustomed to and expected that, understood that to be somewhat of the norm. That was a very small period of time in the longer time map when we think about higher education, when we think about curriculum in school, so on and so forth. And so what we see happening now is much more consistent with the longer time map of history, right? So, and especially when we think about the history of Black education, we know that there's a long history of restricting what can and cannot be taught in the context of schools. I think about a quote every time I have to reflect on the stuff around CRT and what it is that I'm writing about. There's a quote from Toni Morrison in 1991 when she's addressing the Chicago Humanities Festival. And she says, nothing has been so fought over as our approach to knowledge and its parameters. Nothing has been so fought over as our approach to knowledge and its parameters. And I think what Morrison is raising there has to do with a kind of universal phenomenon when it comes to the way power structures canons of knowledge, what can and cannot be taught in formal school and educational contexts, right? And it's something that is, well documented throughout US history, but is also something that if you look to, the apartheid regime in South Africa, what kind of knowledge and information was policed in those contexts, right? If we to look in, think about the Irish traveler community in Ireland and certain kind of histories of kind of marginalized ethnic groups that have historically been suppressed, right? But I think we have a very long history and documentation of that in terms of Black education. And one of the things that we see with, with the justice in with the hearing with Jackson is this demand that she ritualistically denounce certain factions of Black intellectual thought, right? Which is something that we've seen happening with Black educators earlier on as well, to demonstrate that they were not radicals, right? Or for people like Septima Clark to deny their participation in the NAACP or they would be fired, right? So that same kind of surveillance of Black thought and Black intellectual life is something that is very much so deeply ingrained in the longer history of Black education. And we see it coming out in this current moment.
Indeed. Thank you for that. Thank you so much. We will push through. Let's see. We have another question from Sharada. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I am a graduate of an HBCU, North Carolina Central. I went on to a PWI for graduate school, and the transition has been complicated. What advice do you have for those who transition from settings where fugitive pedagogy is innate to spaces where Black people and Afrocentricity are relegated to the margins?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say that, historically, in many kind of like mainstream, historically white institutions, Black folks have always had to be intentional about cultivating counter spaces, right? Having to create, seek out community, right? Having recognized that they're in but not of the places that they're having to navigate. And a lot of the important intellectual traditions that we have grow out of those kind of counter educational spaces where Black students have created organizations in order to sustain themselves, to nourish themselves culturally, intellectually, and spiritually, right? This is whether we look at this kind of back to, even when we think about Carter G. Woodson having to be a student, the second Black person to receive a PhD from Harvard, and I say it every opportunity that I get when I'm at Harvard, right, is that, that folks there may love to celebrate the fact that he earned his PhD there and he's the father of Black history, but we also have to recognize that he had a very violent and traumatic experience to the point where he was contemplating not even completing his PhD in history, right? Because he had professors who flat out told him that Black people had no history and culture, or at least none worthy of respect, right? So we have folks like Woodson who created the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, right? When we think about the emergence of some other Black, professional and academic organizations early on, it's because they were creating these kinds of counter educational spaces to help sustain them, right? And I think that it's important to lift up that history. But then and this is a history that's also a part of, the history of HBCUs as well, right? This is folks like Carter G. Woodson was pushed out of HBCUs because of conservative boards and really the white president of Howard University at the time, right? This is why Jelani Favor's book, Shadow in the Time of Storm, where he's talking about the history of HBCUs and the cultivation of Black leadership, when he talks about the second curriculum, where a lot of this important work that was not able to be formally brought into the curriculum at HBCUs in the early 20th century, how Black folks brought this information together when they gathered, right? In the community that they created, despite the kind of external efforts to control and restrict what could and could not be done at HBCUs, right? That tradition is very much so a part of this history that I'm writing about. And it takes on different forms, whether it's in a majority Black space, right? That has certain kind of complicated relationships to white philanthropists and things like that. But at the same time, Black folks who are in majority white spaces and having to carve out spaces to do the work that they understand to be politically necessary.
Right, so true. So I'm sure that definitely answered her question. Another question we have, how much discovery did you encounter during your research process? Were names like Pennington and the teachers, Henrietta and her spouse, already known to you or only during your research?
Yeah, so I didn't know it. I was unaware. So when I learned that, I read The Miseducation of the Negro when I was in undergrad, not in a class. None of my classes assigned it. A student group that I was a part of, it was required reading for a student organization that I was a part of when I was at UC Berkeley. But then I went on to do my PhD at UC Berkeley as well. And when I came across that reference to Carter G. Woodson writing textbooks, that kind of just raised a question in my head. The idea of Black teachers writing textbooks seemed just went against the grain of the images and the stories that I have been given to think about the history of Black education prior to Brown v. Board of Education, right? We can just think about all the images and narratives that circulate during Black History Month, the images that what little bit we're taught in schools. If we do cover anything about the history of Black education. So I was shocked to learn that Woodson published textbooks, but then after I did some more digging, then I learned, but then there's Lila Amos Pendleton, who was also a public school teacher in Washington, D.C., and Jessie Fawcett, who was a teacher as well in D.C. and also in New York, wrote reviews of Lila Amos Pendleton's book in the Crisis magazine, in the What to Read section, on an annual basis, right? From 1912 up until the time that Carter D. Woodson's textbook was published. And then did some more digging. It was like, then there's Edward Johnson, who also wrote a textbook in 1890, who was a former slave and who was a principal in North Carolina. So I had no clue about this. And so when I was writing my dissertation, I said, I'm interested in thinking about Black teachers as intellectuals, not just practitioners, right? So I didn't know about it. I kind of continued to kind of peel back the layers. And I was able to find references to them in scholarship, but not scholarship that was readily available to me in my journey up until that point. And so, yeah, it was really kind of eye-opening in terms of that process of discovery, because I didn't know about it. And as I continued to learn more, I realized that the story that I wanted to tell was about much more than what I initially thought, right? So it wasn't just about Woodson, but it had to be about situating Woodson in a tradition that precedes him, right? Folks like John Cromwell, Lila Amos Pendleton, and those folks before Woodson, right? Who were operating in this tradition that he was able to expand on, in large part because of some of his kind of relationships that he was able to garner by getting a PhD from Harvard at the time. Even as he wasn't welcomed in the white academy, it still allowed him to kind of make certain connections and build the organization that he did. So in that process of discovery, I realized that I had to do more than just document these textbooks, right? Because it also became about a social history. There was a member of Asala who lives in Maryland, who told me that she had all of these old materials related to Asala that might be interesting for my research. These were just old videotapes from Asala meetings. She said, yeah, sure, come. She invited me to come to her church. And in a storage room, she set up a video, like a TV screen for me to watch these old Asala videos. And I hear a recording of Jerry Moore talking about his teacher, Tessie McGee. Would have never known about that teacher and that story in rural Louisiana had it not been for that kind of information that I encountered in many ways from being in conversation from different librarians and different scholars and folks at Asala, some who are academics, some who are lay members of the organization, but who have personal connections to this work, right? It's something that helped me kind of unpack the story and to develop the ideas and the narrative at various different points.
That is so great. I'm so glad you mentioned, lay persons and just people of the community, because they have a lot of knowledge as well, and that sometimes gets overlooked. But piggybacking, first of all, that question was from Danita Candler. And just piggybacking off of that, I loved that you showed love in your acknowledgments to some librarians, namely Delisa Harris and an archivist, late Pella McDaniels. So that was wonderful. And also you got around, you visited quite a few schools here that you've been to. And I'm curious to know, did you Was there anything in the archives that you found particularly surprising? Was there anything in the archive that you thought you would find that you didn't find? And just if you could talk a little bit about your experience visiting these various archives.
Yeah, absolutely. I must say, yeah, I was really like, I really always enjoyed the conversations with librarians and archivists. And I met Pelham McDaniels when before I even started writing any of my chapters, but because, Woodson papers were acquired by Emory University. And the narrative behind that, there's a whole history to that. Some of the things that I thought I would find in Woodson's collections were not there. Partially because of the fact that his materials have been in many ways kind of like, in some ways kind of scattered. And there was, it wasn't necessarily maintained in the most stable way for a number of years, right? So I'm sure that there were materials that had existed at one point that were not in the irony that the Organization for Preserving and Studying the History of African American Education, the narrative of Black precarity and Black collections, I think is reflected in Woodson's personal papers, and I think is reflective of just the kind of longer history of the precarity of Black education, but also something that Woodson himself was naming, right, is then reproduced in the kind of history of his own materials and stuff like that as well. And it's not just Woodson. I don't have to, this crowd, I think, knows better than I do, right, the complicated nature about and the important work that's necessary about preserving Black materials. But trying to get more information about the records of the textbooks and like the sale, like, the scale and scope of the sales and records and things like that. I thought it would be more easily accessible, but it wasn't. And I had to do a lot of work to try to get a sense of like how to document the reach of these books and these materials that Woodson was producing. But, folks like Pelham McDaniels, when I first got to Emory to look at the papers, like we sat down and he, just talked about the project and, his thoughts on it, why it was important, and some questions that I might think about, right? But then he also told me about, you also might be interested in this other collection. It's not Woodson's papers, but based on the questions that you're asking, you might want to look at this, right? And so, there was an unprocessed collection of a Black teacher, named that was at the Emory collection that, I wouldn't have thought to look at, but I'm now still working on an article based on that collection from that conversation that I had with Pelham McDaniels, but also similar experience when I was at Fisk talking with Delisa and sharing what I thought I was going there to look for. And then her saying, you might also be interested in these collections, right? Based on, the kind of the Rosenwald papers, but then also this person who was very active and involved in this organization. And you might find some materials relevant to your research in that particular collection as well, right? So just those kinds of conversations are invaluable and helps save a lot of time, right, in the research process, especially when you only have a couple of days to be somewhere. But that was one of the things I was just shocked to learn more about the state of the history of Woodson's papers and that journey and the various and how materials may have been lost in the process for various different reasons. That started to raise questions for me, but really encountering the story of how central Black teacher associations were to this history, right? And became an easy way for me to track the patterns, right? So when I realized that there were materials that I wasn't going to be able to find in Woodson's papers, I said, oh, how can I document and identify whether or not teachers were engaging in this work? And a number of archivists, pointed me and talked about the kind of Black teacher associations and going and looking at their journals. And surely it's easy to document that Woodson was present in these places because of their publications, right? But then that became a process of me also learning about how scattered the journals of colored teachers associations were. And then that became a part of like my intellectual project as well, because I have, work that I want to do down the line and I'm looking at these materials. And so that's where this project around the Black Teacher Archive also came from. That was a part of that discovery as well, but also learning about, where to look for some of these materials, again, from folks like, Delisa, who attended a kind of a seminar that I had put together where I wanted to learn from archivists and historians to think about what it might mean to try to create a digital kind of repository that kind of pulls together these scattered materials of colored teachers associations so that they can be preserved and available for research moving forward, right? That was also a part of that process of discovery, right? That was in the background and in the shadow of this first book, but that's also kind of setting the stage for some of the work that I want to do down the line. Because in many ways, my concerns about the exclusion of Black teachers' story from how we talk about the long Black freedom struggle, right, is something that I'm interested in helping us to think beyond, right? To think that we can't understand people like John Lewis, Martin Luther King Jr., and Angela Davis without thinking deeply about the social emotional context of the educational communities that helped develop the leadership visions that they have, right? The visions of justice that they work to enact in the world. And I think the story of Black teachers has really been underappreciated in terms of how we think about the long Black freedom movement. And so preserving the kind of records and the consistent activism and organizing that Black teachers did, often in the shadows, in these professional groups, is a part of my next phase of work. And that's not something that I was expecting when I was kind of, embarking on this journey.
I doubt it was something you were expecting, but I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it. And at first, I do want to say that I really appreciate I always appreciate, I love photographs, of course, as an archivist, but just to see photographs of the young John Lewis, right, and the young Angela Davis, to see them as children, when you normally think about these people being so much, just bigger than life, it really it brings them back down to say that they were regular people, and you can look at their circumstances as children, as you talked about, and all the things that got them to be where the people that they ultimately were is really important. And if you could talk a little bit, I put a link in to the Black Teacher Archives. We have a few minutes. If you could sort of talk about how that began and then sort of the progress with it. I think that's what you're talking about in terms of your future projects as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that question. So that's a project that, I was really inspired by Vanessa Siddle Walker's research as well, and the work that Vanessa Siddle Walker did with the Georgia Teachers and Educators Association. When I was a graduate student, I see my work as an extension of the work and building on the work that Vanessa Siddle Walker did, where she, her book about, it's called The Lost Education of Horace Tate, when she talks about discovering all of the old documents from the GT and EA in the old office building for the Black Teacher Association there, with the person that was the last living executive director of the organization, and how that became the basis of this book that she wrote that was able to uncover this secret partnership between Black teacher associations and the NAACP, which in many ways forces us to revise how we think about the narrative in the road to Brown, where we can't only just think about the lawyers, but we have to think about the teachers who made the work that the lawyers did possible. And so learning about that, but then, like I said, when I was trying to find the materials for Black teacher associations to try to map out this partnership between Woodson and these organizations, I just found the journals of these organizations to be so important, not just for documenting what I was looking for to talk about Woodson and the circulation of his textbooks and Negro History Week in Black schools. And I should say I was doing that because there were some scholars who, when I was initially writing, pressed back and said, well, how can you know that this was as widespread as you're trying to make it out to be? How do you know that Tessie McGee wasn't just one kind of rare case? And I was like, well, because it was. So then I went to the professional organization and said, because it's demonstrated by their commitments at the very top level of their leadership with the work that Woodson is doing, we're able to document this in the formal context of their professional organization. So that became my way of trying to respond to that. But then I realized that those materials are so important for thinking about the intellectual history of Black teachers. This is nearly 40,000 pages of writing by Black school teachers, right? That currently in the current state, you know, that in some places are kind of hard to locate, are not recorded in the library catalogs in some of the places where the materials are. But not only that, but I think that bringing the materials from various different states into a relationship allows us to see patterns across the states and also reflects the networked world that these teachers actually created and how they operated. So you know that what Black teachers were doing in Georgia was not unrelated to what Black teachers were doing in Tennessee, right? So being able to look and study across the journals and publications, and you start to see similarities and similar language, right? Allows for a new level of research that helps us delve into the kind of professional work, the veiled world of Black teachers that we've yet to fully account for. And I'm really excited about that process. And so this project is essentially creating a digital repository that will be an online portal that will house the digitized collections of Colored Teacher Association journals from across the various different states. We're not collecting the kind of physical materials, but just the kind of digital collections that will then allow for in-text searching across the state publications and also the national publication as well. And thus far, we estimate that there were a total of about 2,500 journals published across the various different state organizations. And so at this point, we've identified just shy of about 2,000, about 1,500 of those issues have been digitized, and another 400 to 500 are in the queue to, the details are still being worked out for them to be digitized. And we're still in the discovery phase for like the last 500 issues.
That is amazing. It's quite a feat, but it's an important one. So I'm so glad to hear that. Mm-hmm.
And I also have to say that this work, I'm doing this, this is a kind of a collaborative and a team project, both myself and Professor Imani Perry, who's originally from Birmingham, but as a professor at Princeton, but then also Micah Broadnex, who's the project manager and who's also an archivist who has history working with Black collections and has been doing a phenomenal job helping us kind of bring this into fruition, but also helping me learn, and myself and Imani Perry learn a lot more about the world of librarians and archivists, which has been really intellectually kind of gratifying for a number of reasons. And I'm excited about the scholarship we're going to be able to do to document this process as well and to talk about it. But the kind of the collaborative and team effort around this has really been central from the beginning, even conceptualizing it with bringing together that group of kind of archivists and historians when it was just an idea to this point now, it's still kind of a team and a kind of a collaborative project that I think makes it even more exciting.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad you mentioned Micah. She's actually on this call. I'm not sure if she's still on here, but she has been phenomenal. I think she might have talked to everybody, including myself. And so, yeah, she's doing great work. I'm glad also that you mentioned the collaboration, how important it is to collaborate with librarians and archivists. A lot of historians talk about archives a lot, but they don't necessarily talk about it in the way that archivists talk about it. And so archivists and historians need to communicate with one another, and with the various projects such as the one you're working on and all these digital humanities projects, librarians and archivists are here, and we do have knowledge that we can share. And so I'm glad that you recognize the importance of collaboration. So I think that we are actually at time. I don't see any other questions here. Yeah, Mike is here saying hello.
Hey, Micah.
But yes, I think we are at time. We just have a couple of minutes left. I do have, let's see, one more question I will read because we do have we have only 1 minute left, but we'll take a stab at it.
All right.
What do you think about how Elson mapped Caucasian to Indo-European, which is sort of backdoor to include Africa, since Indo-Europe and Africa are connected physically?
Yeah, I haven't thought much about that part. I just mostly understood the fact that the historian was offering a very clearly white supremacist kind of projection of human history. that I think is reflective of the kind of dominant canons of knowledge during that time period. So I never thought much about, I didn't do much to unpack, that content in the way that this question is being framed. For me, it was just the kind of the fact that this idea that 9/10 of human history have to focus on the Indo-European branch of the race, and this idea that they've dominated the world for the past 2,500 years. I think it just reflected this idea of what constituted the known world, right? The known world is only that which had been known by the kind of European historical legacy and reading American history as an extension of that, which is in many ways what that textbook was doing, that precludes any possibility for thinking deeply about the kind of, Black and the history of the continent of Africa as a part of human history, right? We can read George Hegel into this, who says that Africa is only on the threshold of human history, right? But it's outside of it, right? A very important philosopher who, that really informed a lot of scholarship in terms of thinking about the parameters of history. And for me, that just kind of signals the way that Black people's persecution in the world, their physical persecution, right? When we think about Jim Crow and the violence that Black people experienced, that it was reinforced through curricular violence, like what we see in that textbook, right? That there's a relationship. This is what Woodson argued, that there was a relationship between the violence inflicted upon Black life and the narratives of curriculum and the way that those narratives became expressed through psychosocial behaviors in the world, through lynchings, through segregation, right? Through the kind of stratification of society along racial lines and all the violence that went into doing that, right? So for me, it was mostly just identifying that when I looked to that formal curriculum to understand what these Black teachers were escaping, what they were challenging, what they were refusing.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And that question was from Ayaba Logan. Thank you for the question. And I just will end by saying thank you again. For those that don't have the book, please get it. It's amazing. And you can, let's see, your handle on Twitter is Jarvis R. Givens. And you also have a website, jarvisgivens.com.
Yes, thanks for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much again. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. It's good seeing you again.
Good to see you again, too. All right. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all for joining us.
And if you are part of the Breaking Barriers Symposium, please meet us at either 12:15 if you'd like to network, or 12:45 if you'd like to jump back into the activities. Have a wonderful day.